Okay, so everyone, we've got Carl Moore with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us. He's going to be talking a bit about stratification economics in regards to racial economic disparities in health. So the way this is going to work is kind of similar to how the talk with Derek Hamilton just went. So we're going to have a presentation, and then there will be a Q&A session afterwards. So if you think of anything you want to ask, just submit your questions in the Q&A tab, which you should be able to see on the right. And you can also vote on other people's questions as well. So if you have anything that you really want to see answered, just boost that up. And yeah, that's all for now. From me, I hope you will enjoy it. And here is Kyle Moore. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Renee. And again, thanks to everyone for having me here. My name is Kyle Moore. I am an economist with the Economic Policy Institute, specifically the program on race and ethnicity in the economy. And I'm also a PhD candidate in economics at the New School for Social Research. I'm also what they call a stratification economist, or at least trained to be one, working in that tradition and hoping to add to it with some of my own research. So with this presentation, what I'm basically going to do is, let's see if I can get this to change screens exactly. So I'm going to give a brief sort of recap of some of the things that were covered in Derek's presentation, talking about what makes the stratification economics approach distinct from other approaches ones folks might be more familiar with. Then I'll, talk about some of the racial disparities in health that are there to be explained, and then apply each of these frameworks to racial health disparities to try to tease out what different sorts of approaches and solutions these different schools of thought might bring to answering these questions. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about some of the research that's going into my dissertation. So I have two preliminary chapters here, one focused on the impact of disparities in parental wealth in childhood on adult health outcomes, and a further paper on stratification and stress-related morbidity at older ages. So hopefully we get something out of this. I'll probably go a bit briefer than Derek's talk, since this is supposed to be, I think this is designed to be a more interactive session, something with more Q&A involved. So it might be a little bit shorter unless I just talk for a really long time. But we shall see how the presentation goes. So as a recap, what makes the stratification economics approach distinct? And so we'll start by talking a little bit about the neoclassical approach to racial disparities. And let's get my notes here. Okay, right. So the neoclassical approach to racial disparities explains racial disparities as arising from differences in human capital across groups. That's differences in skills, talents, uh, differential choices made between members of different groups on average. Now, you can take a more conservative bent to understanding those disparities within a neoclassical framework by saying those differences differences in capabilities are innate or genetic, or you could take the comparatively more liberal approach of assuming those differences are the result of cultural differences that have been engendered over time. These could be the result of deprivations, right, that have exposed folks to have somehow lower expectations for their future, which causes them to invest differently in their future. Whatever the explanation may be, the result is that you end up with, on average, different groups of people with differing capabilities, which lead them to have different outcomes within the economy. Um, and that's essentially the neoclassical view of how these disparities, manifest. Within the neoclassical framework, it's also important to start thinking about discrimination and how that arises and what its character is. Within a neoclassical perspective, discrimination is irrational, and it benefits white workers at the expense of both black workers and profits, right? So capitalists within the neoclassical framework don't typically like discrimination, and they typically see discrimination as taking place between workers, a worker saying, I don't want to work alongside a black worker, for example. Um, what the neoclassical framework predicts is that the market will itself eventually over time eliminate discrimination. Why? Because discrimination itself is unprofitable. If you refuse to say hire a similarly skilled worker simply because they are black, or try to pay them at a deficit, or pay a white worker a premium, eventually, so the story goes, uh, the firms that do this over time will be outcompeted by the firms who don't, and therefore any sorts of government intervention that you might want to, or think is a good thing to do for the benefit of black workers, is ultimately either one, unnecessary because the market will take care of itself, or two, might introduce some distortions into the market, which could have unintended consequences. That's the essential neoclassical approach to understanding racial disparities. Right now, the stratification approach was in many ways conceived of as a means to explain the theoretical failures of that perspective, right? One of the main observations was the fact that lots of these racial disparities in employment, wealth, income, health outcomes have been persistent across time, right? Far beyond some reasonable framework of time in which the market would have been able to work those disparities out. And so that's partially the cause of the rise of the stratification approach. But there's another approach that deserves some mention, which is the Marxian approach to understanding racial disparities. I don't want to mischaracterize Marxists as being completely class reductionist, because I know that's not true. But the Marxian approach to understanding racial disparities does essentially locate those disparities as arising from the dynamics of capitalism, the history of class struggle, and the current ongoings of class struggle, combined with racism that has existed in the past, right? So black workers are disproportionately exposed to the poor working conditions, low pay, and unemployment because they disproportionately find themselves in the lower rungs of the working class. So essentially what you have is black workers facing disproportionately the indignities that are associated with the exploitation that all members of the working class face. It just so happens that for historical reasons, more black workers are located in those sorts of occupations, be it past exclusion from opportunities or what have you. Now, one of the crucial differences between the Marxian approach and the stratification approach is their understanding of discrimination. Discrimination within the Marxian approach is largely irrational from the perspective of at least the white working class, right? It is engendered by a mostly white capitalist class, essentially to keep white and black workers antagonistic towards one another. So it's functional from the perspective of the capitalist class, but it hurts both black and white workers, right? Now, my reason for characterizing that sort of relationship as irrational, because it is clearly, in that sense, in white workers' interests to ally themselves with their black counterparts such that they will be able to better struggle against, the capitalist class oppressing them both. So the question, becomes, why not? Why doesn't that happen, right? And I think stratification economics actually provides a decent explanation as to why that's the case. So we get to the stratification approach to racial disparities. What stratification economics attempts to do is endogenize the persistence of racial disparities across racial lines over time. So it provides this rational explanation for the lack of class solidarity you might see between black and white workers. And that comes from the sense that discrimination in that framework is rational for members of the dominant group. Now, that's not exclusive to racial groups. It also applies to patriarchy and other forms of social hierarchy, right? So within a given class structure, racial discrimination is a means by which white workers can maintain a relative position of superiority with respect to black workers. So discrimination works as this functional method of turf defense that's used by dominant groups within a hierarchical class structure. And so this also explains things like, opposition to affirmative action efforts that might take place at, every level of the class structure, not just the lower rungs of the working class, but you can see this at, higher rungs of managerial class. This sort of opposition to diversity and equity that you might see, even in a place like a university, for example, right? Discrimination in this sense, this opposition is working as a means to defend turf, right? Defend this relative position. And that's a unique perspective that's not really found in the neoclassical nor Marxian approaches to understanding racial disparities. So, with that brief recap out of the way, let's start talking about racial disparities in health. So, what is there to be explained? What do we have here? What are we observing? Very briefly, Black Americans live shorter and sicker lives than white Americans. This has been the case for decades of data collection. This is the most recent life expectancy data from the CDC. Black men live about 5 years, 4 years less than white men at birth, and about 2 at 65. Black women live about 3 years less than white women at birth, and seemingly just a year at age 65. What's important to remember with respect to women in particular is that there isn't a compression of morbidity towards the final few years of life. So even though the life expectancy differences themselves might seem quite small, the onset of illness still happens relatively early for Black women. So you end up in a situation where Black women are living relatively long lives as compared to Black men, for example. But more of that lifetime is spent, with activity limitations and sicknesses and morbidities. So these disparities, again, have been persistent across decades of data collection. And then, I think Derek mentioned mortality or pregnancy-related mortality for Black women being, unconscionably high. Same is the case for Native Americans in the U.S. as well. This is a graph from the I think Kaiser Foundation. But yeah, it shows that there are many times higher pregnancy-related mortality for Black women as compared to other groups, and this persists across class and across wealth and across educational categories. To talk briefly about some of the COVID-19 disparities, which are particularly relevant these days, Black Americans have been disproportionately affected by this virus. They are, 3 times more likely to be hospitalized for COVID-19 as their white counterparts, and twice as likely to die from the disease, as referenced from the most recent CDC data. There are a couple of explanations for this. One of those are that, they're both more likely to work in the frontline sorts of occupations that increase exposure to the disease, and they're more likely to have the pre-existing conditions that make coronavirus infection deadly, right? Heart disease, asthma, hypertension, obesity, diabetes, etc. And some recent data has shown that due to the disproportionate impact of COVID on the Black community, disparities in life expectancy are projected to increase by nearly 40% over 2 years, for Black vis-a-vis white Americans. And again, these are the outgrowth of structural sorts of explanations or structural reasons lead to these disparities. But again, there are various different explanations for these disparities that we can talk through and try to understand. And that's what I'll sort of do now. I'll try to walk through some of these, again, using the sorts of framework that we developed earlier on, right? So what are some different theoretical approaches to understanding racial health disparities, and how might the stratification economics framework lead us to a better understanding, or I might argue a better understanding of these disparities. So if we're thinking about the neoclassical approach, one of the most salient models within the neoclassical framework is a health production function. Um, and that's essentially the resources that one is able to amass are used as an input into one's own health, combined with the different decisions that one might make in order to invest in oneself. So, health disparities between individuals arise within the neoclassical framework out of different health investment decisions. So within that framework, you conceptualize health as an outcome of a series of forward-looking decisions made over time, right? So in the starkest view of this, you have individuals and groups on average who have what's called low discount rates. In other words, they don't particularly value the future less than the present, right? So if you have a group of people with this sort of mindset, right, they tend to make decisions early on in anticipation of living a long life. In the starkest view, that might be investing in education to attain a high salary job, so they can live in a safe and healthy environment and establish better health habits early, right? These sorts of decisions are seen as driving what leads to better health outcomes in the future, right? So if you have groups of people who are having distinct health outcomes over long periods of time, the neoclassical framework leads one to reason that that may be because certain groups make health optimizing decisions better than other groups, right? It's not necessarily that they are making more optimal decisions, because the assumption is that the group with comparatively worse health outcomes simply have utility functions that are formed in such a way that they don't value the future in the same ways, right? And if you want to take a quote unquote liberal perspective to understanding that, it might be that their environment has engendered within them somewhat rational low expectations for the future, right? So you can imagine that a person who is well-meaning and meaning to be progressive might say that, oh, the environment that these folks grow up in has just led them to have such low expectations that they don't make the investments that might lead one to having better health outcomes, right? I might look at an explanation right like that, especially when applied to racial health disparities, and call that out as being racist. But despite that, that is the way the logic of that framework goes. You can even extend that to understanding intergenerational health outcomes as well, right? If you say that an individual who has reason to have a low discount rate, they may invest in their children's future in such a way that they have better health outcomes and better life outcomes, generally speaking, right? And those that don't make those same decisions have some reason for making different choices, but the choices are indeed at the root of the differences, right? And again, other approaches dispute that sort of framework. The Marxian approach disputes this framework, and the stratification approach disputes this framework as well. So when you take a Marxian political economy of health approach, right? Again, health disparities are resulting from the dynamics of capitalism in history. Um, uh, Capitalists seek to exploit workers where they can, right? Working conditions that deteriorate health fall disproportionately on workers without the recourse to negotiate for better or more favorable conditions. Capitalists locate polluting factories disproportionately in areas where the land is cheapest for capitalists to locate them, and also where residents lack the political economic means to resist the location of those factories there, right? So essentially, these are the dynamics of a capitalist system, right? And because of historical circumstances, again, it just happens to be the case that more Black workers are located amongst the poor, and more Black workers are located amongst the lower rungs of the working class, without recourse to resist or struggle against, their capitalist exploiters. And within this framework, it's very much the case that, or it would lead one to believe that the health outcomes that Black workers disproportionately experience because they are of the working class are also experienced by the white working class, right? Um, thinking this logic all the way through, you would assume that the white working class and Black working class, and essentially, and you know, members of the Black community who managed to make it into the managerial class should have comparable health outcomes to the rest of the managerial class, right? You would assume that racial disparities may exist because of class differences or differences in the class composition of each group. But controlling for those, you would expect racial disparities to very much diminish. Now, the reality and largely what the stratification approach hopes to bring to understanding health disparities uh, is a understanding as to why it is the case that many health disparities do persist across class, right? So again, the stratification approach. I'll stop to say briefly for a bit of history, but stratification economics actually was initially conceived of as Black political economy, right? So there's a lot of you know consonants between the Marxian approach and stratification economics. They're not so far apart as one might imagine. Um, so it concurs with the Marxian approach that on the importance of history. Stratification economists might emphasize the various exclusions that Black Americans currently face and have faced from opportunities to build wealth historically, wealth being a protective factor that can lead to better health outcomes over time. It also might influence or also might reference occupational segregation that results from racial discrimination over time and a lack of proper remuneration from skill acquisition. Donnie and Francis in the other room was probably talking about how education does not provide the same sorts of benefits for Black students as it would for all students, or as you might assume, right? Human capital does not necessarily translate into remuneration in a straightforward way, right? And that segregation might lead to concentration in jobs with less control, flexibility, fewer benefits. Uh, Again, we can see this with the COVID-19 data, right? Black workers were disproportionately likely to work in occupations that didn't have access to paid leave, didn't have access to the ability to work from home, and were disproportionately likely to not have access uh, to protective equipment on the job, or and we know that Black workers are disproportionately likely to not be able to negotiate with their employer to at least reduce work strain. This comes from studying older workers in particular. So one might assume that that also led to a less likelihood of being able to protect themselves against COVID-19. But further, again, we understand that differences in socioeconomic status explain some of the gaps in health equity between Blacks and whites in the U.S. This significant portion still exists even when controlling for that. And there's some evidence that experiences of racial discrimination, again, that functional turf maintenance that exists to maintain relative position for members of dominant groups within hierarchical societies, there's some evidence that that may increase it while moving up the SES ladder. There's a reason to expect that as well, right? If there's potentially more to gain, more to lose, you might see more fierce opposition to to say, for example, something like a diversity and equity initiative or affirmative action. As you move up the SES ladder, you might face more accusations of being, there because of affirmative action, right? So these experiences have been associated with harmful chronic stress. And we know from the social epidemiological literature the impacts of chronic stress on health outcomes, right? This chronic activation of the systems in the body that are designed to deal with acute stressors. If these are constantly activated, that can, permanently, do things like, or it's associated with uh, more heart disease, particularly cardiovascular diseases, right? And there's further evidence that the high effort coping associated with socioeconomic mobility may be particularly harmful for Black Americans, and that is compiled in a body of research known as John Henryism and led by Sherman James within the public health and social epidemiological literature. So those are some different approaches that you can take to understanding racial disparities. I myself am partial to the stratification approach. I think it's more attuned to both the persistence of racial disparities over time and the persistence of racial disparities across class groups, right? Um, so now I'll talk briefly about a couple of the projects that I'm working on in the context of my dissertation. These are preliminary results, really, but I want to talk a little bit about the ideas that are coming out of, I can say, the stratification economic space with respect to health disparities, and see whether or not these are, useful concepts for folks to start thinking about. So the first paper is looking at the impact of racial disparities in parental wealth on adult health, right? So the idea is to use the panel study of income dynamics to estimate the effects of parental wealth on adult health outcomes of children in those 1984 households in 2017 when they're 32 to 50 years old. So I want to investigate whether and to what extent racial disparities in parental wealth contribute to racial disparities in adult health. Parental wealth being measured as net worth, adult health being, a collection of health outcomes, but I'm particularly interested in those related to cardiovascular health. All right. And one of the major themes in the stratification economics research, particularly the empirical research, has been intergenerational wealth disparities, right? How the source of wealth disparities itself is linked to parental and even grandparental wealth acquisition, right? Intergenerational wealth transfers are a primary method by which wealth is built within the US. It's not simply making good financial decisions. It's not simply saving, right? Making good investment decisions. It's largely determined by intergenerational wealth transfers, largely determined by, like having parents who can give you a bailout at a particular juncture of your life, pay for an education, for example, pay for a wedding, pay for a down payment on a home, give you an inheritance once they pass. So there are lots of reasons there's lots of evidence that racial disparities in wealth are persistent across generations. So one idea is to see the impact of that process on health outcomes. And so for some preliminary data we have here, just looking at the SES and health of 1984 household heads within the PSID, Black households were much more likely to have zero or no wealth, less likely to be healthy, more likely to have less than a high school diploma, less likely to finish a college degree, and the median total wealth of those households in 1984 was quite low, as was the median adjusted family income. When you look at the children of those household heads, you see that, in fact, it's actually quite interesting that white households have actually gotten, the children of white households are actually more likely to be low wealth as compared to their parents, right? That is, I think, a result that folks have kind of been aware of over time. But again, Black households still less likely to be very healthy. All households are more educated. Black households still more likely to have less than a high school diploma, less likely to have a college degree, and still those wealth gaps are distinct and significant between those groups. This is 2017 data. Now, if you look at some select health outcomes by quintile of parental wealth, for the white, these prime age white children of these 1984 household heads, these more or less follow a predictable pattern as you move up the quintiles of parental wealth, self-reported health status as being very good. Um, oh, actually, I labeled this incorrectly. Sorry. This should be um, that should not be very good or excellent. That should be poor, right? So you're less likely to report having poor self-reported health as you move up the quintiles. Apologies for that. But likelihood of stroke and hypertension tends to be decreasing somewhat, um, or at least the trends here are not particularly strong with respect to parental wealth. But if you look at the uh, black children of these household heads, you see an intriguing sort of result that, for hypertension, particularly for stroke, um, many of these um, many of these health outcomes are either increasing or non-decreasing in parental wealth, and so that's an intriguing result. Could it be the case that uh, persisting in these, high wealth households at this, as a Black American leads to certain experiences of discrimination that manifests over time? That's something that there's further study needed. But some of the results in discrimination seem to suggest that that could be the case. It could be the case that discrimination has these effects over time, and that's something that I want to look further into, and am doing so to some extent in the final paper I'll discuss, which is again stratification and stress-related morbidity at older ages. This is taking the health and retirement study, which has the psychosocial leave-behind questionnaires, um, to investigate the relationship between experiences of discrimination, low access to economic resources, and the manifestation of stress that those two combined experiences might produce, and their effects on hypertension and inflammation. Um, so this is the basic idea here, right? Racial stratification leads Black workers to experience high exposure to potential stressors, combined with having low access to economic resources. Those might combine to produce stress, which then in turn produces the physiological effects of hypertension and inflammation, both of which are risk factors for cardiovascular disease. That's the conceptual model there. Uh, the experiences of discrimination that we're looking at are, major experiences of discrimination. I won't go through all of these because we're getting short on time. We're supposed to be doing some more Q&A. It's basically these experiences of discrimination combined with low economic resources. Um, Black workers are indeed more likely to experience these forms of discrimination, at least in this health and retirement study sample. Um, they are indeed more likely to have low wealth, low family income, and low economic resources. And then they are more likely to have the combination of those two things, experiences of discrimination and low economic resources. The health outcomes I'm looking at, again, blood pressure and inflammation. Black respondents in this sample were more likely to have high systolic and diastolic blood pressure, more likely to be taking blood pressure medication, which you reason out to believe they're more likely to be hypertensive, and they're more likely to experience inflammation. And so when you're looking at this preliminary relationships between this measure of stress and racial health disparities, you see that, for one, this measure of stress does seem to predict higher incidences of high blood pressure and inflammation, and even fair or poor self-reported health uh, across race. But the effects of this seem to be stronger for Black respondents, or I should say that Black respondents, whether or not they experience stress, tend to have greater incidences of both blood pressure and inflammation and fair poor self-reported health. So it does seem to be associated with worse health outcomes. And it's plausible that Blacks' higher experience with said stress could be linked to their greater experiences of those poor health outcomes. So that's some of the preliminary work that's going on in this space. And that's essentially the presentation. Hopefully folks have gotten something out of seeing these frameworks put against each other, and hopefully the stratification approach is can add to the conversation on racial health disparities. And that's it for me. So yeah, I'll stop sharing. There you go. Great.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, that was no, really informative, especially the comparison of the three different ways of thinking about racial disparities right next to each other. We don't usually see that. I think that more people need to be aware of that. So thank you so much.
No problem.
Um, right now, we should have a Q&A. Sorry, Kyle, can you see any questions at all on your...
I can't.
Ah,
I answered them all.
okay. Right. Okay, guys, do you have anything you want to ask? Like anything else that you want to explain? Or maybe, okay, I think I have one.
Sure.
So you explained a lot about what you think, what you think maybe say the cause, well, the say the evidence towards different racial disparities and a bit about why you think they may be. So more to do with Black people being seen as the underclass and not having as much access to resources or opportunities. So what do you think might be, have you ever thought about any potential remedies in terms of, say, greater education of this problem or anything to do with increased government incentives or anything like that at all?
Yeah. So one thing I always like to say when thinking about racial disparities is that one of the most important things we can do is change our frameworks for thinking about them. That's why I'm passionate about the work that happens in places like rethinking econ, because a lot of the problem comes from you know having a limited framework in terms of what you think the solution could be, right? If you think that the problem arises from poor choices being made by the black community on average in terms of financial investment decisions, health decisions, etc., then your solutions are going to be targeted at teaching people to do things differently, right? Teaching people to invest their money differently, or doing individual health consultations. And that's not to say that that's not helpful at an individual level, but when we're thinking about groups, right, there are structural causes for these disparities that we see over time, right? So in terms of concrete policy solutions, you want to do things that affect large swaths of people. And again, one of the effective solutions we could use, I think, right now, something like raising the minimum wage. And again, this is in the U.S. context, but raising the minimum wage is something that could potentially affect large swaths of the Black community and significantly reduce poverty, set a wage floor, change the bargaining conditions for workers across the spectrum, but particularly for Black workers. Another thing is, making it easier for workers to unionize. This is somewhere where, Marxist political economists and stratification economists might have some, consonance in terms of understanding the ways that bargaining within the workplace can change the living conditions of workers and the working conditions, and, change their fundamental health outcomes. In terms of persistent wealth disparities, right? In the US context, one thing that you have to consider is reparations, right? You have to consider the intergenerational persistence of these disparities. We understand the historical roots of these wealth disparities, and we understand that, white wealth in America was not built through hard work, grit, and good decisions. It was built through specific access to government programs that Black workers, Black families were largely excluded from, and goes back as far as the periods where Black families and Black individuals were indeed capital, like were indeed wealth. So, in order to rectify those sorts of disparities that have existed for generations, you need true, at the root, radical sorts of policy prescriptions. So, reparations is one of those, and there are more. The federal job guarantee is something that can deal with the employment gaps as well. Um, Baby bonds are another method of reducing wealth inequality. So there are a number of policy I say that to say there are a number of policy perspectives that are compatible with the stratification perspective in terms of reducing racial disparities.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think so. I guess another question I wanted to ask was a lot of, following on from that, a lot of solutions that you just proposed are things that are seen as being discussed as potentially being implemented throughout America, regardless of race or potential different groups. So, for example, raising the minimum wage, um, things like that. Do you believe that instead we do need to, for example, specifically target disadvantaged groups? I guess specifically saying, for example, okay, these Black people do need a raise in the minimum wage, and we will specifically target conditions for Black people because that tends to get a lot of pushback. That tends to be seen as, say, positive discrimination. Do you think that there's a way to balance that at all?
Sure, I think that race-specific policies are an important area to research. I think reparations are one that are, very obviously a race-specific sort of policy. A lot of the, sort of live policy prescriptions that are out there right now are typically designed to be universal and disproportionately benefit the Black community. Um, but there are, undoubtedly some areas in which you have to be specific in terms of redressing harm. Again, I think you know reparations that is explicitly meaning direct transfer payments to descendants of slaves in the U.S. Right? That's one policy that I think is um, race specific and probably necessary to reduce racial wealth gaps to any significant degree. And again, there are moral reasons for doing that as well. Um, but but yeah, I think uh, functionally speaking, it's difficult to do a lot of racially specific policy in the U.S. just because of the way that again, it's considered positive discrimination, so there are political hurdles towards doing things like that, despite the fact that they might be needed. One potential example is areas in, related to COVID, right? COVID vaccination, COVID testing. One could imagine one saying that uh, because of the death rates, Black Americans might be a prioritized group in terms of vaccination, right? In terms of hospitalization rates and death rates, are much higher, right? It's just in the data. I imagine it will be quite difficult to get that through. Um, but that's not to say it's not needed.